Hey everyone, welcome to episode 2 of the Deeply Devoted podcast, a ministry of the E-Free Church of Bemidji, Minnesota. My name is Eric, and here on the Deeply Devoted podcast, we'll explore a new topic each week to help us become deeply devoted followers of Jesus together. Today on the Deeply Devoted podcast, we are talking about why a church might want to start a church podcast and how this medium can be used as a tool for discipleship. And when I had this idea for our church, I knew that I needed some help. And so after reading a blog article on the EFCA website, I reached out to the guys at the Shades Valley Community Church in Homewood, Alabama, and I sent an email and I said, hey, I'm just getting started. I'm a rookie at this. Can you guys give me a hand? Can you guys maybe give me some advice or tell me just a little bit about how you are using your church's podcast? And lo and behold, I actually got an answer back, and I was so pleased to get an email back. And so it is my privilege today on this very first interview episode of the Deeply Devoted podcast to have with me Pastors Jonathan, Brad, and John Mark from Shades Valley Community Church. So guys, welcome to what will be episode 2 of this brand new podcast.
Eric, thanks so much for having us. It's funny to hear you say that you were shocked to get a response. I feel like we should let your church know up front that we find ourselves in a very interesting position of being the quote-unquote experts on this, quite by happenstance. We're at a small church, a small EFCA church down here. We're not mega church pastors. Nobody here is famous beyond our own families. No one knows who we are. But we have been doing a podcast for our church for, almost 4 years now. I guess it's been 4 years. Mm-hmm. And we've learned a lot along the way. And the guys that run the EFCA blog got in touch with me not too long ago, having noticed our church podcast and asked if I would write a blog. And we're like, sure, thinking we'd never hear anything from it. So we were just as surprised to get your email as you were to get our response, and are very, very happy to be here and to get to just talk about this avenue of discipleship.
Fantastic. Yeah. And hey, maybe you guys are just a few more steps ahead of where I am, or at least 4 years ahead of where I am on this thing. But yeah, just good to hear from you guys. And we're just going to dialogue a little bit about podcasting and how your church uses this. But first, I'd love to just get to know you guys a little bit more. So would you guys each take just a second and tell our Bemidji church family a little bit about really your church, about Shades Valley Community Church, and in particular, what is something that God has been doing lately at Shades Valley?
Well, do we want to go around first and just introduce ourselves and then say a little bit about the church?
Sure. So I'm Jonathan Haves. I'm Jonathan Haves. I'm the senior pastor here at Shades Valley. Shades Valley has existed since 1991, but I've been the lead pastor here since February of 2012. Married, 5 kiddos, 23 years in ministry, and love the EFCA. John Mark.
Yeah, my name is John Mark Durow. I'm the worship and communications pastor here at Shades Valley. I've been here since the fall of 2013. I was actually here part-time from 2013 through 2019, and then in April of that year, 2019, I came on full-time as the worship pastor here, and me and my family love it. We love Shades Valley. I grew up here in the Birmingham area, so although I'd never heard of Shades Valley, once we discovered it, just fell in love with the community here. I'm married. I have 2 kiddos, and I've been playing music and leading worship for a very long time. Since I was a teenager, I've been leading worship. I've been playing music since I was about 5 years old. So,
yes, and I'm Brad Brown. I'm an associate pastor here at Shades Valley. Been here since 2012. I am also in the process of becoming a licensed professional counselor, and I work at a private practice here in Birmingham, Alabama. We're technically in Homewood, but we always say Birmingham because there's a better chance of people actually hearing that. I'm sure your listeners are already judging us because they heard that we're in Alabama. So we would love to defend ourselves, but unfortunately, I don't think there's time. But yes, I'm at a private practice here. I'm married and have a daughter that's almost 2, and my wife is currently pregnant, due right around Christmas. So that's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the three of us have been at Shades Valley for over a decade together, which has just been a real gift from the Lord. And we've gotten over the years to see the Lord do a lot of different things, a lot of amazing things. We've been through some really hard times. But I would say one of the things that comes to mind when you ask kind of what's the Lord doing right now. So we are a congregational church, but we are elder-led. But over the course of the last year, we made a move to actually officially have the office of deacon at Shades Valley. We hadn't officially had that before. And so through a process, we taught about it, we instituted it, and one of the things I think that we have seen through that is just an explosion of activity amongst the body, ministry amongst the body. Mm-hmm. So our initial group of deacons have really latched on to their role as servants and ministry leaders, and there's probably more ministry and ministry opportunities happening right now at Shades than ever in our time here, and we're not leading any of it. And so that's been a really cool thing to see just over the last year. A lot of just ministry bubbling up through the membership here at Shades Valley.
Yeah.
I don't know if either of you guys have something that you want to add.
No, I think that was a great example.
John Mark, maybe just about the new Shades project coming up, that's something that was birthed out of our community that's continuing to bear fruit?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, like I mentioned before, I've played music for a long time. I've been writing music for a while, and several years ago had the opportunity of getting together with some songwriters within the body here at Shades, some folks that were members here, and we went away on a retreat and started working on corporate congregational worship songs that we wanted to write for the local body. Obviously, there are a lot of great songwriters in the Christian music industry and at some much bigger churches in the United States and across the globe, but we wanted to create art and corporate worship music that could be sung here locally at Shades, and then hopefully, maybe that springs up at some other local congregations here in the Birmingham area. So we several years ago, we got together, started writing music and songs, and we put out our first record under the moniker of Shades back in 2022, and that record is called Wanderings. It's all original worship music that was written and recorded by folks that were here at Shades, and we're actually working on another follow-up to that album, so a sophomore release. At this point, it's just going to be a shorter release, like more of an EP, maybe 4 or 5 songs, but maybe we get in the studio and we really get that energy going, and we're like, oh, let's just go ahead and do a full length. Why not? But we're working on that soon, so we're actually going back into the studio in September. It's just exciting to, have songs that were written by folks here within the body and that we sing on Sunday mornings. So it's been really cool to see.
That's fantastic. Yeah, one of the topics that I'm hoping to explore later on this podcast is similar, just what makes a good worship song. There's so much out there, and how does a church know what to sing on a Sunday morning, how to think through those things. Sure. And, one of them is that I haven't thought about, though, is that topic of deacons and the role of deacons. So that may be a good one to explore, too. Now, just as an aside, if I'm hearing you right, I say Birmingham. I'm hearing you say Birmingham or something like that. So maybe that's just way up here in the north. Maybe just as we might have an impression of Alabama, you guys might have a impression of northern Minnesota, way up here just a couple of hours from the Canadian border. So we couldn't be more physically separated, I think.
Right.
It's probably a little bit of our southern drawl, because we do say Birmingham, but maybe when we're talking, that southern accent comes out a little bit.
And all you have to do to have a southern accent is just be really lazy while you talk. That's it.
That's right.
That's all it is.
Just be relaxed.
Yeah,
Yes.
people would generally tell you that Birmingham is in England, and
That's right.
Birmingham is in Alabama.
Yeah.
But I think that
Yes.
that we just get lazy while we're talking.
Yes, well, Eric, I'm curious, what comes to your mind when you think Alabama?
I might have to say Leonard Skinner, but
There you go.
Very common
Yeah.
answer. Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I haven't spent much time down in that part of the country, so got to get down there. Yeah. Well, hey, we're talking about discipleship as it relates to podcasting. And here at our church at Ifri Bemidji, we are often using this language of becoming deeply devoted followers of Jesus together. That's how we talk about being a disciple and making disciples. Now, I got on your church's website and I saw this phrase, glorifying God by loving Him, loving others, and making disciples among all people. I'd love to hear from you guys a little bit about what does disciple making mean to you? That's a little bit of a churchy term. What does it mean to make disciples?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that even your phraseology really hits at it, deeply devoted followers of Jesus. So, I mean, discipleship in its essence is being a follower, being a student, being someone who is learning to walk in the way of Christ, to serve, love, lead, be on mission with Jesus. At Shades, I would say one of the things that's really interesting about our community, and honestly, it's one of the things I think that led to us doing a podcast as a means of discipleship. One of the things that's interesting about our community is it is the least programmatic church and community I've ever been a part of. And so you usually, when people talk about what does discipleship look like at your church, they're asking for what kind of program you have in place.
Right.
What are the 5 steps that you go through at Shades Valley in order to be discipled? And we don't really have that. What we have are relationships. And so even when we talk about the things that are quote unquote programmatic, so for instance, community groups, we will talk about there being organized and organic community at Shades. Or when we talk about serving and like being a part of a serving team, we'll talk about there being organized and organic ways to serve. And what we mean by that is organized. We do have serving teams you can sign up for just like you could at any other church, whether that's a greeter or you're working with a worship ministry or what have not. But then we also have people who serve the body without ever signing up for any kind of list. For instance, one of the people we often reference is a man by the name of Bill Ferris. And Bill Ferris is probably one of the most praying individuals I've ever met in my entire life. Mm-hmm. And he prays for everybody and anybody in this body all the time, whether he's calling them, leaving voicemails, or whether it's here on Sunday. Bill never signed up to do that. There's no box to check on that, but yet that's serving, and it's serving the body. And so we like to try and find a way of recognizing that and talking about that. And the same thing with community. We have official community groups, but then we have some people who aren't necessarily in a group that meets at a regular time in a regular place, but they are deeply plugged in and connected within our community and relationships in which they are learning more about what it looks like to follow Christ and being conformed more into His image. And so discipleship at Shades can feel a little unwieldy at times, where you'd love to give it this kind of like neat little nice definition or 3-step process, when really the primary thing that we encourage as far as a path towards discipleship is investing in relationships with one another in the body And it's through doing that life together and through those relationships that discipleship happens, that we point one another to Jesus, encourage one another in Jesus, and grow in Christ-likeness.
I love it. I love that context of doing life together, doing discipleship together, learning to follow Jesus together. Yeah, and just how that happens maybe a little bit more organically. And yeah, how maybe you put a little bit of structure around that, but just let it happen. Fantastic. Yeah. Anything, Brad, John Mark, you'd add to that in terms of just what does that idea of disciple making mean to you?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things you're going to quickly see from Jonathan is he can very concisely give a full answer and just kind of tie a bow on it. And so normally Jonathan communicates extremely well, but I think...
Also known as takes over the conversation.
No, there was no dig here. Let's be clear. I was encouraging him.
I receive it.
Yes, that's right. Receive it, please, Jonathan. Yes, so, I'm trying to think about what to add, but maybe just for our context specifically, we'll talk about discipleship happening through worship, serving, community, and mission. And so sometimes when people are looking for a discipleship process, there's a beginning and an end. Okay, where do I start? Okay, well, start here. And then next, and there's not to say that there can't be any linear moves that people can make at a church. But what we've found and what we found can be helpful for people as they're asking this question is, okay, let's kind of step back and take a larger picture of discipleship. And let's talk about discipleship through worship in our worship gathering and what happens there. Let's talk about discipleship through community at Shades and how discipleship happens there. Let's talk about serving. Let's talk about mission and how discipleship happens in the way that we approach mission and how we serve. And so that's been another way that we've talked about it, especially when people come with that question of how do I grow as a disciple at our church? And that answer is not necessarily sexy. I don't know if it's going to sell any books, but it seems like it's what the church has been doing in some form or fashion since its origin. And so we want to continue in that.
Yeah, and just to as way of an illustration of what Brad is talking about, for instance, so when we tell people, discipleship happens in worship, and we want to put some meat on those bones, one of the very practical things we'll say is at Shades, we sit in a circle in the round. If you come into our sanctuary, it really looks like a semicircle, but we talk about how the worship band completes the circle. But we tell people we do that so that you can see one another when we worship. Because when I know Brad and I know that he and his wife are in the midst of going through a miscarriage, and I'm looking across the room and I'm watching them sing about the faithfulness of God, this is discipling me. This is strengthening my faith in Jesus. This is how worship is a part of discipleship. Yes, also through the sermon and actually, hearing the word of God exposited and sinking my teeth and my roots deeper into the truths of God's word. But we mean every aspect of it. And so it's by, like Brad said, it's not this really sleek, easy thing to just explain and rattle off, but trying to help people understand how every aspect of what we do together as a body is either helping us grow towards Jesus or it's just turning us in on ourselves. And so trying to help people see how what we do through all that we do is meant to be conforming us more to the image of Christ. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even our church is thinking through a little bit of that idea of a discipleship pathway. And even in some of our conversations recently, we've realized it really isn't linear. Maybe in a perfect ideal sense of a brand new believer could get in
Sure.
at phase one or whatever you would call it, or step one, but it doesn't always work that way. And so there's multiple entry points there, and just not a program, but there's an intentionality to everything we do as a church in terms of making disciples.
Yeah.
That's right. Well said.
Well, let me talk a little bit about your podcast, Shades Midweek. And I'm curious about how Shades Midweek became a podcast, and a little bit about how is that different from your weekly sermon audio that you post on your church's website?
For sure. So just in talking about discipleship and not being overly programmatic, one of the disadvantages of that is that there are things that were poured into, like I remember from my childhood, I grew up in a church that was extremely programmatic. And so there were certain things that all of the programs afforded the church the opportunity to make sure were being communicated and poured into me, whether that was the importance of mission and getting to hear from missionaries, or whether it was doctrinal training, or whatever it was. There were lots of different avenues for them to make sure those things were being communicated. When you're not overly programmatic, you have fewer of those. And I do think it's more common today for churches to have less of those traditional programs. So, for instance, we don't have a Sunday school. We don't have a Sunday night service. We don't have a Wednesday night service. So we have Sunday morning, and it becomes really hard for Sunday morning to bear the weight of everything
Yes.
you want to teach
Yes.
or accomplish or any of those things. And so part of the idea behind starting a podcast was, here's something that doesn't feel overly programmatic. It feels a little more organic, and it's kind of reversing the traditional way of thinking about discipleship. So instead of designing a program that's happening here on our campus, this is us trying to find a way to actually go into our people's homes, into their lives, into their cars, into their jog, into their whatever, and to bring discipleship through in an avenue that way. And just with the open-ended conversational format of a podcast, it afforded us the opportunity to really address any of the topics that we wanted to be able to do things like interview missionaries and have our congregation be able to have those times that for me would have happened on a Sunday night growing up, but have those times of hearing extended reports from missionaries or getting to know our ministry leaders. It afforded us the opportunity to address maybe really specific doctrinal issues. And so yeah, there was just a lot more open-endedness to the format, and it felt like it filled in kind of this discipleship gap. As far as how it actually started, I had done a podcast with Brad years ago as really primarily just a supplement to our Sunday morning
sermon. Yeah.
Things that had been left on the cutting room floor. It gave me an opportunity to kind of flesh those things out. And this was when Brad was part-time and John Mark was part-time, and so he wasn't able to be involved in the podcast at all, which meant the technical side fell to me, which was not a good thing. And so it kind of fizzled over time. And I would mention every now and then this idea of bringing it back, but I wanted it to be a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And as Providence would have it, we tackled it in January of 2020. Right before COVID happened,
Right.
None of us knowing that's what was coming. Would either of you guys like to jump in at that point and give your thoughts on the start of Shades Midweek and what that was like?
John Mark was very hesitant. I'm just going to speak for him.
Yeah.
He was not thrilled about it, I don't think.
I think I just, when we were starting with the idea, we kind of toyed around with what the podcast could look like. And so we did like these test episodes, if you will, where we recorded ourselves doing a podcast format, but we weren't actually going to release it, but we were just kind of testing it out to see how it worked. Because that made me more comfortable. I was a little uncomfortable with the idea of just walking in cold and not really knowing what we were going to do.
If you go back and listen to
tell me about it. Yeah.
If you get,
Right?
if you go back and listen to our first episode, it might be the first two. John Mark's not even in it.
Yeah, I'm just
sitting.
managing,
He's sitting
I'm just
behind the
manning,
board.
the production side of things and making sure things are recording
Right.
and working. Okay.
We slowly pulled him in.
Well, and the other part was we really didn't have any gear either, and so that was a big part for me. Just being a musician, I wanted to have the gear. I needed the mics and all the
Wants
things
to do it well.
I wanted to do it well at the highest quality that Shades Valley Community Church could do, and so it took some time. And I can't remember who came up with the tagline. This is a podcast about theology, culture, and all things Shades. But I think once we zeroed in on that, I'm sure it was Jonathan. Once we zeroed in on it, that helped us kind of flesh out what the podcast could actually look like. And as we got into it, we just let it organically happen over time. I don't think we knew, down the road that we're going to be doing lots of meet a member episodes with our members, or we would do episodes about movies and albums and things like that. It just all sort of started to happen and come together. And like Jonathan said, we started it in January of 2020, right before everything got real crazy in the world. And I mean, you can listen to some of those early episodes. It's kind of funny when we address COVID and we just have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe we'll have a service in 2 weeks or something. I don't know.
COVID-19? Is that what they're calling it?
Yeah,
Is
we
that-
didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we it was funny. Like, we knew more why we wanted to do a podcast than what we were going to do.
Right.
That's right.
And like John
Sort
Mark
of a
said,
learn as you go.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, very very much so. And even the tagline that we use, a podcast about theology, culture, and all things Shades, it gave us direction, but also kept it general enough that we honestly could do anything we wanted to do, which was what we were aiming for. And yeah, it became. I honestly think COVID happening was what really began to help us see the potential of the podcast, how important it could be, and what it could do, because all of a sudden we weren't meeting in person anymore, and the podcast became this point of connection. And really, I think it was when we began to do the Meet a Member episodes, which I could be wrong, but I think the first one happened because we just didn't have another idea.
Maybe so.
Right.
We were like, what are we going to do this week? And so we're like, let's just interview somebody. And so when we do a Meet a Member episode, we just bring in one of our members and really just get them to share their story and their faith journey. And that, honestly, those have become probably the most consistently well listened to episodes.
Absolutely.
But it's really interesting that something that's, I think we talk a lot about how digital means in our world are actually points of disconnection, not connection. So whether we're talking about social media or whatever, we'll talk about how these things actually separate us. And it was actually really interesting to see how the podcast could be used as a point of connection, because when we would bring somebody in and they would share their story, inevitably that would lead to other people who didn't have relationships with them before, then having conversations with them. Because they'd be like, hey, I heard you share your story on Shades Midweek, and I really connected with this part. And we've seen literal friendships born out of those things. So yeah, that kind of series of events is how the podcast came to be and what began to give it momentum and direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting as I've gone and listened to a few of your episodes.
Oh, boy.
Very encouraging. But in a lot of sense, it feels like I'm eavesdropping in on what's happening in your church.
That's awesome.
That clearly your podcast is for your church family. That you don't really seem to have an intention to, even though I find it on Spotify or you can find it on different places, and so anybody can access it. It's really designed for your church family.
Yes.
And I love that about that. But I'm kind of curious about, I don't know the makeup of your church, but I'm guessing it's a pretty broad spectrum of people. In our church family, we've got people who I would classify as, intense digital consumers. They're online, they're using smartphones and apps and know what a podcast is and things like that. But we also have some people that would admittedly say, look, I'm just not tech savvy. Somebody else set up my smartphone for me,
Right.
things like that. So how has your church family embraced this podcast? And have you tried to encourage everyone to listen and subscribe, or just how have you engaged your church family with this medium?
Yes. So I think first, one thing is that we have not taken the podcast seriously. And part of that, I think, is just the makeup of our church. Not that we're not taking what we talk about seriously, because we're talking about serious things, but we don't take ourselves seriously. And so we don't see this as, oh my gosh, here is this, gift that we are giving to our church body, and we just think everyone should listen to it. It's so important. We just have not. We'll make a lot of jokes about it. We will. We'll make jokes about how long the podcast goes. Having tens of listeners, yes. And so I think just that posture of like, hey, here's something we're doing, and we hope that you would find it beneficial. If you want to, give it a listen. And in regards to who it is appealed to, let me tell you, Eric, it has totally shocked me. There are people who have said they listen to every episode, and it has nothing to do with age or how tech savvy someone is, or even if they have like a particular interest in theology, or even if they listen to other podcasts on a regular basis. And so there are people in college that tell me they listen to it on a regular basis. And then there are people who are retired who we had to show them how to download the podcast, who will listen to it as well and come up and reference things that we've talked about on it. So
yeah, to use an example, I sat down for lunch one day with a visitor, someone that I actually knew outside of Shades that had started visiting Shades Valley, him and his wife, and we sat down to just chat and see how things were going. And he told me, he said, I have listened to every episode of Shades Midweek, and I think they had only visited the church a handful of times, but he loved the podcast so much that they started attending Shades, and he had listened to every single episode. So he probably knows more about Shades Valley than some of our elders do.
Well, and what's funny, to John Mark's point, that's what I was about to bring up, is I have been shocked by the number of visitors I've sat down with who have listened to Shades Midweek. But here's why I think that's attractive and why I think people do that. There's really not another avenue like it that I can think of to get to know a church before even visiting a church. So you think about the fact that like the overwhelming majority of people, before they visit a church, they're going to go read a church's website. They may even watch a service or listen to a sermon. But everything there that they're interacting with is something that's more formal, or it's like prepared, pre-written, whatever. There's really no way to be like, but what are these people like?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
what's it like to be around them?
Right. And just like you said earlier, when you listen to the podcast, sometimes you feel like you're eavesdropping on a conversation, and I think that's what people feel like is before I ever even set foot in the door, I can kind of get to know the pastors, get to know the dynamics of what they're like and what their relationships are like. Is this a healthy place? And then because of the Meet a Member episodes, they can also get a decent idea of what the membership's like and what people are like here. And so, yeah, like Brad said, it's really hard to pin down and predict who's going to engage. I will say this. There are people who are dedicated listeners, listen to every episode. And then there are other people who will just pop in when they know we interviewed somebody they want to listen to, or we talked about a specific topic they wanted to listen to. And some of our episodes are way more serious than others. We've done some episodes that are pretty heavy as far as just the content. But we do use multiple avenues to keep the congregation abreast of the fact that the podcast exists and it's a resource and it's available. So we send out a weekly email that has just everything happening at Shades, and in that email is always a reminder about what the Shades Midweek episode was for the week. John Mark runs our social media accounts, and he'll pretty regularly post something about what the episode for that week was about. And then even on Sunday mornings, there are occasions where I've more than once referenced a Shades Midweek episode in a sermon. Mm-hmm. Or I've said, hey, we don't have time to talk about that right now. We'll do a Shades Midweek episode about it, and we'll go on to do an episode about it. And so there are a couple of those natural means that kind of keep in front of people the fact that the podcast exists and it's available as a resource. And I would honestly say percentage-wise, we get really good engagement. So our church membership sits right around 170 members. And what's the average episode download, you would say?
Probably average around, definitely over 100 for sure. Some of our more listened to episodes can get up into the 200s depending on who's on and how long it's been available. People tend to catch up over time, so they're not listening maybe to that week's episode. Maybe they could be a month behind, you know? So
Sure.
Hey, folks, I need to break into the episode here for a second and let you know that while we were recording this interview, we had a little bit of a technical glitch. And for the last part of the interview, my audio got kind of garbled, and you'll hear that in the rest of the episode. Fortunately, the guys at Shades also recorded things on their end, and they sent me the audio, at least for their portion, which is a majority of the rest of the interview. So hang in there to the end, and hopefully we won't have this technical glitch in the future. So it looks like you guys have recorded over 200 different episodes of Shades Midweek, and I'm curious, just over that time, what is something about the podcast itself that you just didn't expect or that you didn't foresee when you recorded that first episode?
Mm-hmm. There's one thing that comes to mind for me, which has been a lot of fun. I did not think we would be able to get quote-unquote well-known names in whether that's theologians or pastors who have written books, commentaries, who are very accomplished in their fields. I didn't think it'd be possible to get them on the podcast, and it's really been very doable. And, I mean, I guess in full transparency, we don't pay people for coming on the podcast. We don't have ads on our podcast. Just in case your church listeners are thinking this is like a massive podcast, it's not. Subscribers would be very low. No one would say, hey, would you, Crossway's not coming to us being like, will you do an ad? Nobody cares, right? So, but all of these different figures very humbly and generously have just come on and given us their time. And these are experts in the fields of New Testament, Old Testament, biblical systematic theology. These are people who have written books on various subjects, books on sexuality, books on politics, books on mental health. And so it's been so exciting because we will interact with these authors, or we will interact with these theologians, and what we'll normally be thinking is, man, I really wish our congregation could listen to these people, hear these people talk about these various hot topics, or think about these, or hear these various people talk about different theological issues, because it's so helpful. And so the opportunity to do that we did not foresee has been so exciting and so fun. And so often we're just like little kids getting to meet, our hero that nobody knows who these people are, they're theologians or whoever, but we're just getting to be able to talk to different people.
Yeah. Well, and it's so cool, too, because, for any of the guests that we're talking about, so even whether they're more well-known or not, I mean, to bring any guest to your church to teach in any form, like it could, I mean, for you to bring us there or for us to bring you here would cost tons of money just in travel and covering expenses, not to mention you want to give somebody an honorarium.
We can't do that.
Yeah. But to have somebody on a podcast, they're like, sure, I'll give you 45 minutes of my time, and so it's just it makes things that would have only been possible, I think, for very large churches with very large budgets, it makes it much more possible for a church of our size to get that kind of personal engagement with voices throughout the larger church. And so, yeah. One other thing that comes to mind for me, just things we didn't expect, to still be doing it after 200 episodes.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
That was my thing.
Never expected it to have the staying power that it's had.
Yeah.
And just to, I mean, there almost every aspect of it has been unexpected. But to see the way it's become a thing, even having people on like from our congregation as guests. So we mentioned that we do the Meet of Members, but we also will do episodes that people within our body have more expertise in. So, for instance, John Mark has mentioned the fact that we've done like some movie reviews and things like that, and we have a couple of people in our body that like film was their major in college, and they're still deeply invested in film critique and such. And so we'll bring them on as guests.
Artists or
Yeah, we've had artists on. We have
musicians.
We have one member who we have an episode planned to talk about artificial intelligence, which none of us are qualified to talk about, but he is.
But certainly a topic that other people are thinking about and asking questions about. Yeah,
Right.
That's right.
And so it's been cool to get to do that. But even in doing that, like how many times a member has been on the podcast has become a thing. And so like we have a 5-timers club.
Nice.
Now,
Nice.
you know, and we're talking about getting a coffee mug made for the 5-timers, things like that. So I don't know. There's some really fun aspects to it that have been really, really cool. And then there are also just some really serious isn't the right word, but we've had the opportunity to interview some people just with really impactful testimonies, or to hear about some really important and impactful ministries in our area, in our city, that we weren't aware of. So one of the ones for me earlier this year, I think it was at the beginning of this year, that was really, really impactful was we interviewed an organization called Alabama Abortion Recovery. And it's this ministry that ministers to women who have had abortions, and to have these ladies come in and share their own personal stories and then share about the work that they're doing was just absolutely incredible. And a far cry from obviously the lighthearted episodes that we do.
That's right.
And so I don't know, just the breadth of what we've been allowed to do, been able to do, and the fact that we're still getting to do it, and it's become something that I think means a lot to each of us personally as well. It's become just another, I don't know, really life-giving part of ministry.
For episode 100, we did a live episode, which typically you wouldn't do for a podcast, but some podcasts do this now. They may do like special traveling shows, and they'll do like a live thing. And we did a live episode on a Wednesday night, and we invited the congregation, and that was really affirming, I think, for us. As we saw that, oh, wow, people actually have bought into the idea of this podcast and what it is, and kind of some of the silly aspects to it as well. And that was just a really great moment, I think, for us to kind of see everyone come together. And it became, as we were talking about earlier, social media or technology can feel disconnecting. It felt like this communal experience through these means of technology in which we use. It was really cool.
That's neat to just hear that your church is taking ownership of it, and it's beyond just the three of you, and it really is becoming a useful medium for your church family. I think that's what I really appreciate about podcasts. Again, you can get on these platforms and you can find millions and millions of topics and subjects and things like that, but I think about just that on a practical level. As much as I'd love to hand a book to somebody in our church and say, read this, or go listen to this sermon or something like that, some of the things that really have impacted me, not everybody's a reader, not everybody consumes some of that media, but to be able to say, boy, I'm hearing this from my pastors, someone that I already have some rapport with and some trust, and I want to sit down and listen and think through some of these topics, and especially topics that just maybe don't fit well into a Sunday morning sermon. As I'm listening to you guys, I'm hearing you say that it's more than just sort of the footnote to the sermon. Okay, here's the part that we couldn't include in the time slot. But here are things that just don't really work on a Sunday morning. And I love that idea of how to use that medium for those purposes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because back to I was just going to very briefly say, I think this goes back to discipleship and what we said earlier, and how we saw that our congregation is constantly being discipled through media.
Yes.
It's happening through social media. It's happening through podcasts. It's happening through YouTube. If a person comes up to me and asks me a theological question, one of my first thoughts is, okay, who are you listening to? Who'd you, not critically, just I'm curious, how'd you even hear about this? And we were just kind of asking, okay, how can we get a foot in that game, and how can we provide an avenue where people can hear our reflections? Because we talk about how the pastor can be losing his position in our society, and among church members specifically. So people don't go to their pastor for theological questions, they type it into YouTube. But then that also kind of caused us to reflect on, okay, well, how can we provide ways to be accessible to people and provide ways for them to hear from us on a variety of different issues that they have genuine questions about? How do Christians think about this? How do Christians respond to this? And so I think the podcast has been so huge for us. And I'll just say, I think it's also allowed us by the Spirit and by God's grace to grow in courage and say, okay, first, I think we would be really scared to talk about politics
Right. Yeah,
on a podcast.
right. Yeah,
This is a hot topic. Who are we going to offend? Are we going to upset somebody? Is somebody going to leave the church? Is this going to cause division? And through approaching the topic with humility and going to the scriptures and discussing it with ourselves, we said, no, we feel like we can come to a place and we can talk about this, and people may disagree, right? But maybe they can come and actually talk to us about what they disagree with. So sorry, I went on a little bit of a tangent there.
No,
but
perfect.
I think it's really been a powerful tool for discipleship in that vein.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point on this idea of, people are being discipled by all kinds of things, other people, other mediums. And we don't think of it that way, because when we use the word disciple, we use it in a church ministry context. And, I'm not being discipled. I'm just learning from, this YouTube creator or this influencer out there, this other podcast. But if we stop and we think about discipleship as being taught and being instructed, absolutely we are. And what is informing our worldview, and it doesn't even have to come from a Christian worldview in the sense that it is discipling us. So I love that.
That's right.
Just get your foot in the door and be able to really deliver not just better content, but help people to think through it more biblically.
Yeah, I want our people to think of the word influencer as a modern synonym for discipler. Like, that's what this person is doing and what they're trying to do by aiming to influence. They're aiming to disciple you. And so that was part of the original conversation about doing a podcast is, okay, the world is doing everything they can to go into our people's homes.
Yes.
Into their lives, into their pockets, into their cars, into whatever, to disciple. So let's enter into that space, and it's been a good medium for doing that.
Well, I know you guys are busy pastors. I'm sure you've got a lot on your plate this week, so I just want to ask one more question, and really just briefly, I'd love to hear from each one of you. What is one thing right now that has been blessing you towards deepening your devotion to Jesus? Maybe it's a book you're reading, maybe it's another podcast out there, or something you did last week. What's one thing that has been blessing you lately that is deepening your devotion to Jesus?
So I'm going to out myself right here, and that I'm not a big podcast listener.
That's okay. That's okay to admit. Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of irony in the fact that I help host a podcast and don't really listen to podcasts that much, but I can always talk about books, and so I'll mention two things really quickly, and John Mark and Brad will try to not roll their eyes too hard. I'm currently reading a Tolkien biography. And I'm a huge Tolkien fan. I'm just a massive stereotype of an evangelical pastor in that way. And but that's been a lot of fun and just really enriching just to see the disciplines in another person's life and what makes them the way they are and tick that the way that they do. And Tolkien's faith as a Catholic was quite intriguing to me. And I would dare say I think that he was a bad Catholic, bad enough to be an authentic believer in Jesus. And so, and his Catholicism was more of a devotion to his mother than anything else, which is really an interesting aspect to his life. But then, of course, you get his influence on C.S. Lewis and things of that nature. Anyway, that's been blessing me a lot. But then the other thing for me right now is I think I mentioned earlier, I have 5 children, and my 2 oldest kids are both in high school now. And my wife and I feel like we have transitioned into a new phase of parenting. Like we've been in a phase for a very long time that we knew very well and were very comfortable with all our family routines, all of those things. And now we are moving into kind of these unknown, uncharted waters for us. And I have fought it tooth and nail because I do not like change. And the Lord is using it as one of the primary means of sanctification in my life right now. And particularly, my eldest daughter is on the spectrum. I've got a great relationship with her, but my next child, my son, who turns 15 in like 6 days, the Lord has been very kind to give us a very good and rich relationship, even as he enters into these teen years that I think can be stereotyped by rebellion and all of those things. And I don't know, the Lord is just continually working through him in his exploration of his faith as he grows to mold and shape my own heart. And so that's been a really, really fun process.
Fantastic.
Yeah, for me, I actually just got done coming off of a 12-week sabbatical.
John Mark is glowing with the radiance of the glory of God right now. He's been to the mountaintop.
That's right. One of the cool things and one of the ways in which Shays Valley Community blesses the pastoral staff here is this was a thing before I was even here, that the pastors here on staff get a 12-week sabbatical every 7 years here in ministry. And so I just finished my first sabbatical. It was incredible. It just really gave me an opportunity to slow down and spend time with my family and visit other churches and really connect with some folks that lead worship that are also worship pastors, connect with them, chat with them, and just be encouraged ultimately and be refreshed. So I am about 3 weeks now out of that sabbatical, and it was I just think back on it, and it was such an incredible time, and what a blessing it was that that the pastors here get that opportunity and just get that blessing. So that in particular, and I will say too, I will add, I have some friends that live in Atlanta. They're worship leaders. They're a married couple, Shane and E.B. Cole. I play a lot with them. I sometimes I travel over to Atlanta if they need a musician to help lead them with leading worship, and so every time I'm with them, these two are the most the joy of the Lord just oozes from them when you're around them, and it encourages me every time I play a service or do a retreat or a conference with them. I come back so refreshed to see these two that lead worship and love the Lord so much. They're so genuine and authentic. And so I just did a thing with them last weekend and just came back just feeling refreshed. It's really good, I think, for musicians to have those experiences, because I think musicians and artists in particular, sometimes we can have a propensity towards cynicism, especially when you do something often and you work within a certain like worship music industry and you see things behind the scenes. But being with them, it is a whole different ball game with them, and so that's just really been blessing me personally.
Brett, how about you?
Yeah, so two things. I will mention a podcast and YouTube channel, unlike Jonathan and John Mark, because I am not just concerned with Shades Midweeks, but want to promote others as well. And so in that selfless attitude, let me point out Gavin Ortland. I don't know if that name sounds familiar. He has a ministry. Have you heard of him before?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is me here, but I just think his ministry called Truth Unites is just a gift to the church. And he is someone who embodies a Christ-like humility and love. In his channel, he is addressing a variety of different topics. And so there's apologetic issues, there's theological issues, but I've just found so many of his videos so helpful, and I think people that are listening would find some of his videos helpful as well. You can kind of scroll through. I mean, it's a variety of different topics, some that you may be interested, some that may cause you to fall asleep. But nonetheless, there's something there for everyone. He's written several books as well. So I'm just so thankful for his ministry. It's been a huge blessing to me recently. And then the second thing is particular to Shades Valley, and that is this past week, I've just been so grateful for the relationships that I have within this body that have come from being here at this church since 2012. And committing and staying at one church is hard. I mean, it is very hard. And there will be inevitably times where you want to leave, where you are fed up with people, where you kind of fantasize and idealize about being someplace else. But if you are able to stay at one place, the depth of relationships that will come from that, and the joy that will come from seeing people change and grow over time, will be such a gift. And so even just this past week, I was blessed by several members who just selflessly use their gifts to serve the body. They don't have to be doing this, and they've used a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy in a variety of ways, and it's been such a gift to us. We could not do what we do here at this church without them. So I'm encouraged by their faith and their commitment.
Well, guys, I'm so thankful for your time today to help us get this podcast off the ground for the E-Free Church in Bemidji. And so on behalf of the church family here, we send our greetings to you guys and the Shades Valley Community Church. I'm going to link in our show notes here both to the blog article and also to the Shades Midweek podcast. So if you see a rise maybe here in a couple of weeks of listenership, maybe it's us. Maybe you can track where listeners are coming from. If you see a blip from northern Minnesota, that would be us.
Well, Eric, we want you to know if you get any negative feedback, please send it to us. We want to be in full support of your podcast, you doing this. And if there are any complaints, let us know. We got your back, okay? We are so pumped that you're doing this.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, guys, I really appreciate the support and the time you've given me today. So that's going to do it for this episode of the Deeply Devoted podcast. And Lord willing, there'll be another one after this. So thanks for listening. One last thing before I go and before you hit stop, I want to let you know that the guys at Shades Valley Community Church actually turned our interview into an episode of their own podcast. And so if you search for Shades Midweek on your preferred podcast platform, you'll find it under episode 215. their August 22nd episode. And so you can kind of listen to the mirror image of this same interview. Kind of fun to be a part of what they're doing at Shades Valley. So hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll be back next week with episode 3.